Terminator Salvation. From the Ashes. A novel by Timothy Zahn. Chapter 13. Dusk had faded to full night when Orozco finally heard the distant sound of minigun fire. He stood up from the fountain rim where he and Wadley's fire team had been sitting and crossed to the archway. The Terminator fire was coming in short bursts, he noted grimly. The rhythm that would typically be used to clean out a house after a successful breach. So far, he hadn't heard any answering fire, but maybe that was just being swallowed up by the louder sounds of the miniguns. Or maybe all the victims were dying before they had a chance to shoot back. There was a movement at the corner of his eye, and he turned to see Grimaldi come up beside him. "So it started," the chief said quietly. Orozco nodded. "So it would seem." "Yes." Grimaldi paused as another burst of minigun fire split the night. This group coming from a different direction. "So you were right." "Yes," Orozco said flatly. "I was." "So that's it," Grimaldi said, an agonized ache in his voice. "We're all dead, because of me." Orozco looked at him. The chief was staring out the archway, his face drawn, his eyes wet with tears of regret, or anger, or frustration. And for a long moment, Orozco wanted to tell the other that yes, this was all his fault. But he couldn't. He couldn't kick a man who was watching his worldview crumbling right in front of him. "We're not dead yet," he said instead. "If you're finally ready to help, you could go check on the fire teams on the balcony. Make sure they're ready." Visibly, Grimaldi pulled himself back together. "Yes, I can do that," he said. "Do you want me to go look at the loading dock area too?" "Sure," Orozco said. There wasn't much to do back there that hadn't already been done, but he could understand Grimaldi's sudden burning desire to do something. "Then come back here, and I'll set you up with one of the flanks. Any more of your allies sitting it out?" Grimaldi winced at the word allies. "Probably," he admitted. "I don't know how good most of them will be in a fight, though." "Trust me, there will be plenty of work for them to do," Orozco assured him. "We need people to carry ammo, patrol the inside perimeter, carry messages, move and assist the wounded, build up and repair barricades and fire stations, and eventually move the dead." A muscle in Grimaldi's cheek twitched. "You want all the children here too?" "Anyone who can help, yes," Orozco said. "No one gets a free pass tonight." "I understand," Grimaldi said. "I'll go get them." He moved away. Orozco watched him go, then turned back to the darkened street outside the archway. Listening hard to the minigun fire, he tried to estimate the position of each of the groups of Terminators, and to estimate when one of those groups would arrive at the Ashes. Full night had fallen, and the team was indeed ready, when Connor finally heard the distant sound of minigun fire. "That's it, people," he said. "Time to move." The other men and women in the room didn't need to be told twice. Already they were grabbing their packs and guns and doing their final weapons checks. "1 minute," Connor said. 60 seconds later, they were ready. He cracked the door and took a careful look outside. All seemed clear. "Remember, radio silence if at all possible," he said. "David?" David nodded, and he and his demolition squad slipped past, disappearing into the night as they headed out toward the access shaft, where they would enter the tunnel that ran alongside the Skynet warehouse. Tunney was next, his squad slated to follow David's group as rear guard until they split off to approach the staging area from the west. The newcomers were the latter group, Callahan and the Iliakis and young Zach. They had wanted to go with Barnes's squad, but Connor had judged Tunney's to be the one where they would be the least in danger, as well as where their inexperience was least likely to get someone else killed. Ideally, of course, he would have preferred to leave them here with Kate in the relative safety of the temp base, but they'd made it clear that they were going to go out there, either with Connor's people or by themselves. Better they at least go with someone who could look out for them. The Iliakis were the last of the squad out the door, and Connor felt a twinge of guilt as he watched them go. Carol had quietly insisted on going into danger with her husband, exactly as Kate had wanted to do with her husband. Only in her case, Connor had said no. And then it was Connor's turn. He gave Kate a silent nod goodbye, got one in return, and led his team out into the night. Distantly, he wondered if Kate was thinking about the Iliakis too. The gunfire had slackened somewhat, he noted, as he and his 4 teammates moved quickly but cautiously through the deserted streets on their way to the staging area's southern edge. The Terminators must have finished off one of their targets and were in the process of moving on to the next one. Fortunately, the recruitment tours they'd made of the neighborhood had marked most of the inhabited buildings where the Terminators were going to be gathering. Hopefully, the routes Connor and Tunney had mapped out would get them all where they needed to be with a minimal chance of running into trouble along the way. Shh, shh! Someone behind Connor hissed a warning. Instantly, Connor dropped into a crouch, the rest of the squad doing likewise. The thought flashed through his mind. Minimal doesn't mean zero. Half a block to their right, striding away from them down the street, were a pair of T-600s. Connor eased his hand away from his rifle and onto one of the blast grenades at his belt. The Terminators were facing away from his squad, their attention clearly elsewhere, but that didn't mean they might not suddenly decide to look behind them. Especially given that Skynet's spotters were already in the air. The hunter-killers drifting over the city were playing it cool, running with spotlights off and minimal turbofans, but Connor could already hear their rumble as they watched for any refugees who might try to slip past its ground forces. But, like the T-600s themselves, the hunter-killers were evidently focusing for the moment on their own map of targeted buildings, leaving the neighborhood's uninhabited areas alone. The 2 T-600s came to the end of the block, turned the corner, and vanished from sight. Still watching the corner, Connor rose from his crouch. "Damn, that was close," Tony Tantillo muttered. "Where's our air support anyway?" "It'll be here," Connor assured him. Somewhere down the street, from the vicinity of the Moldavia, the miniguns opened up again. "All those children," Kate had said earlier, troubled by the thought of leaving them to die. All those children. But it was out of Connor's hands now. Signaling to his team to follow, he continued on into the night. Yoshi was strapping into his A-10 when Blair finally made it to the hangar. Come on! The call came 3 minutes ago," Yoshi called impatiently. "What's the holdup?" 90 seconds, Blair promised as she sprinted toward her own fighter. "Wince? Yo, Wince?" "Right here," the old man said, popping into view around her plane's nose. "You're all set, I think." "What do you mean you think?" Blair asked as she stopped beside him. I got you an extra 150 rounds for your GAU-8, just like you wanted, he said, patting the Gatling gun protruding from the plane's nose. But I have to tell you, there's a chance, a really small chance, that the gun will jam up first thing off the chocks. Really? Blair said. Let me get this straight. My options are either I get to completely snooker the hunter killers with extra firepower, or else I get to be flying toast. Wince made a face. Something like that. Good enough, Blair said, grabbing the cockpit ladder and heading up. I'll let you know what happens. The hangar doors were open, and Yoshi was jockeying his A-10 out into the wide street beyond by the time Blair got her engines up to power. She gave Yoshi a 30-second head start, then followed him out. To her mild surprise, both planes reached the end of their Avenue airstrip and made it into the night sky without any hunter-killers appearing overhead to argue the point. Hickabik? Yoshi's voice crackled in her headset. How you doing? Smooth and hungry, Blair replied, glancing over her board. The GAU's counter, she noted, still indicated her ammo load at 1,100 rounds, which implied that Wince's extra 150 weren't being registered. She would have to remember that as she watched her fire count. Ready to kick some? You bet, Yoshi said. You're on cleanup. Follow me in. His A-10 turned left toward the Skynet staging area. Blair matched the maneuver, falling back far enough off his tail to make sure he had all the fighting room he might need. There were 4 hunter-killers in the air over there, running dark and probably quiet, drifting along over the multi-block region like vultures waiting for something to die. Little did Skynet know. She and Yoshi had covered about half the distance when the hunter-killers suddenly seemed to notice that they had company. 2 of them veered suddenly out of their lazy search pattern and turned toward the A-10s, jumping like scalded frogs as they kicked their turbofans to full power. Watch it! 2 more coming in from the north, Yoshi warned. Blair peered in that direction to find that the 2 new bandits were also coming in dark. Big surprise there. I see them, she confirmed. Which ones do you want? You know how my vertigo is, Yoshi said. Blair smiled slightly. Happy hunting, she said, twisting her stick over. She sent the A-10 into a hard turn north toward the incoming hunter-killers, a turn that would certainly exacerbate the imaginary vertigo of any pilot. The 2 newcomers were coming in fast, she noted, as she settled into an intercept course. Way too fast for a typical dogfight. Had Skynet analyzed her performance over the years and concluded its best bet was a high-speed skimmer attack? Or had it conceded the point of her combat record and decided to simply ram her and be done with it? There was one way to find out, aiming her A-10 squarely between the 2 incoming aircraft. She nudged up her speed. The hardest part about playing chicken, the old saying went, is knowing when to flinch. But the hunter-killers hadn't seemed to have heard that one. Neither aircraft veered so much as a degree off their intercept course as they all rushed toward each other. Blair gave it 3 more seconds, and then it was time to flinch. But not the kind of flinch she would normally do in this situation. Not her usual tight, evasive turn to left or right. Doing the same thing over and over against Skynet was a guaranteed way of getting yourself killed. Instead, she jammed the stick forward, dropping her nose and throwing her A-10 into a power dive toward the streets below. She was instantly vindicated as the 2 hunter-killers split formation, twisting to right and left as they shot past overhead. Had she turned in either of those directions, she would have ended the evening inside a massive fireball. Which might still happen. For the second time in 3 days, the dark streets were rushing up at an ungodly speed. Gotta stop doing this, she told herself firmly as she hauled back on the stick, twisting her fighter up again just in time to avoid splatting herself all over the landscape. Setting her teeth as her plane switched from power dive to power climb, she waited to the near stall moment and rolled over into her signature Immelman turn. She leveled off, eased back on the throttle, and searched the sky for her opponents. She'd half expected the hunter-killers to try to take advantage of her vulnerability during the dive by turning around and attacking. Instead, the two aircraft were speeding away from her at full speed, curving around toward the northeast, and continuing to angle apart to keep her from taking both of them in a single 1-2 shot. In the absence of a 1-2 shot, a 1-1 shot would do just as well. Lining up her nose with the hunter-killer on the right, she keyed for the GAU and squeezed the trigger. Wince had been concerned that his upgraded system would jam. Blair hadn't had any such doubts, and as usual, she'd been right. The Avenger roared to life with all its throaty glory, spitting a river of 30mm destruction at the enemy aircraft. The river reached the hunter-killer, and in the fiery light of the machine's explosion, Blair continued her turn and nailed the second one as well. The two groups of flaming debris rained down on the long-suffering city. Blair put her A-10 into another curve back around toward the west. There was a third bonfire on the ground in the distance over there, where Yoshi had apparently taken out the first of his two targets, and Blair could see the faint flickers of gunfire flashing back and forth as he engaged the second. Beyond the dogfight, the two remaining hunter-killers were still gliding over the staging area neighborhood, playing spotter duty for the mass slaughter going on in the streets below. She gave the sky a quick scan, and then a more careful look. Far to the south, faintly silhouetted against the moonlit clouds, were two more hunter-killers, probably part of Skynet's Capistrano radar tower defense. Either the neighborhood slated for tonight's destruction was a particularly important one, or else the computer figured it could afford to spend a few hunter-killers for the chance to take out a couple of Resistance A-10s. Blair smiled tightly. If burning through hunter-killers was Skynet's plan for the night, she would be more than happy to accommodate it. Turning her A-10 onto an intercept vector with the newcomers, she headed in. The Terminators who had destroyed the Death's Head compound were finally on the move. Though not very well, or very quickly, Kyle noted. Even after a couple of hours of running repairs, the three skinless machines were still limping badly as they headed toward the gap in the north barrier where he and Star had entered the compound earlier. Limping badly enough, in fact, that the three machines were actually shuffling along together as a group, with the two outer ones supporting the third. Their red eyes glowed bright in the moonlight, the faint sheen from their metal bodies looking strangely like human sweat. But if those three no longer posed a serious threat, the fourth Terminator most certainly did. It walked a few paces behind them, matching their speed but with no trace of their limping. Its own eyes swept the compound alertly as it herded the damaged machines toward the gap, its minigun poised and ready. Kyle tensed, holding himself as still as he could. If one of the four Terminators happened to look into the cars they were passing. But none of them did. One by one, they maneuvered through the gap and disappeared into the night. Kyle took a deep breath, feeling the tension running out of him like rainwater off a collector gutter. "They're gone," he whispered to Star. There was a pause, and then she tugged gently on his sleeve and started signing. "Wait a second," Kyle said, pulling the jacket away from their faces so that he could see her better in the dim light. The full chill of the night air struck him like a slap across the face. "What did you say?" "Where did they go?" Star signed. "I don't know," Kyle said. "They're gone. Isn't that enough?" And right on cue came another burst of minigun fire from somewhere west or northwest of them. somewhere in the direction of Moldering Lost Ashes. Kyle listened to the gunfire, his throat tightening. His people were under attack. People who had taken him and Star in when they didn't have anywhere else to go. And Orozco was there too, who'd been their teacher, their guardian, and their friend. But there was nothing he could do to help them. Besides, he'd promised Orozco he would stay away from the place. And he had a responsibility already, a responsibility named Star. "Come on," he said. He eased himself up out of his sitting position, wincing at the sudden twinges of pain in muscles that had been too still for too long. Getting a grip on the edge of the windshield frame, he pulled himself out of the car. From inside, only the very edges of the compound had been visible. From outside, though, the full extent of the carnage could be seen. Kyle stared at the bodies littering the street, his stomach churning, a small part of his stunned mind grateful that the darkness hid most of the details. He turned back as Star emerged from the car. "Over here," he said, putting an arm around her shoulders and turning her away from the bodies and toward the gap between the cars. "We need to make sure Fido's still with the broken ones." She frowned up at him. "Fido?" "The Terminator who chased us after they killed Vuong and the others," Kyle explained, grimacing at the memory. The traitors had made their own promise to Orozco, a promise to protect him and Star, and had been murdered for their efforts. "It's just something to call it." "What does it mean?" Star asked. "I don't know," Kyle said. "I heard once that it was a name people used to call their dogs, family dogs." He added as her eyes widened. "Not the wild ones." Stepping to the edge of the gap, he looked carefully out. The damaged Terminators hadn't made it very far. They were not quite a block away, plodding along together like gangers drunk on homemade wine. Fido was still walking behind them, its head turning back and forth, probably looking for fresh targets now that Skynet's killing spree had begun. Star caught his arm. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere away from here," he told her, giving Fido one last look and then stepping back into shelter around the front of the car. "We'll head east, the direction we were going when, you know." "What about Orozco and the people at the Ashes?" Star asked. Kyle grimaced. Star had that look about her, the one that said she was about to go all stubborn on him. "There's nothing we can do to help them," he told her firmly. "Besides, Orozco told us not to come back." The look darkened a little more. "We can't just leave them," she signed. "Orozco told us not to come back," Kyle repeated, starting to get angry. "We can't just leave them," Star signed again, and crossed her arms across her chest. Kyle clenched his teeth hard enough to hurt. Couldn't she see he was trying to help her? And then he took a closer look at her face. Behind the angry defiance, he could see the trembling lower lip and the tears in her eyes. He sighed. She knew what he was trying to do all right, but running away, she wouldn't be able to live with herself afterward. Actually, come to think of it, Kyle wasn't sure he could either. "Fine," he said, giving up. "Stay here a second. I'll go find a couple of guns and we'll go back to the Ashes and see what we can do to help." Steeling himself, he headed into the compound. There were dozens of guns lying around the street among the dead bodies. Kyle chose a rifle with a nearly full clip, gingerly removing an extra clip from the body of the man whose fingers were still wrapped around the weapon. A pump shotgun was next, along with a small pouch full of extra shells. Additional ammo for his Colt wasn't quite as simple, but it took only 4 tries to find someone carrying rounds of the right caliber. He was stuffing the extra cartridges into his pockets when Star suddenly appeared at his side, her face taut. "It's coming back," she signed. Kyle didn't need to hear any more. "Let's go," he muttered, throwing a quick look behind him as he looped the shotgun over his shoulder and grabbed the rifle. Nudging Star ahead of him, he headed toward the line of cars at the southern end of the compound. Star had ducked through the wide gap the other Terminators had made, and Kyle was starting to follow when the roar of automatic fire split the night, and a crackle of shots slammed across the car beside him. Kyle threw himself behind the car as a second burst shredded the rusting metal. "Go!" he shouted at Star, looking around. "That building, there!" he added, pointing to a dilapidated 4-story structure just to the west of them. "Go on, I'll catch up." Star's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded and sprinted toward the building. Lifting the rifle to his shoulder, Kyle eased back to the end of the car and looked around it. Vida was striding across the compound, its glowing red eyes sweeping the area as it looked for something to kill. Sighting carefully along the barrel of his rifle, Kyle squeezed off a shot. The round slammed into the Terminator's hip, and for a moment its stride faltered as it worked to regain its balance. Kyle fired another shot, this time at the machine's knee. It began staggering slightly, then sent another burst from its minigun into Kyle's shelter. Kyle fired twice more, then ducked back from the gap and headed after Star. The girl had made good headway, but Kyle had longer legs, and he caught up with her before she was more than halfway to their target building. "Come on," he said, grabbing her hand and pulling her along with him. If they could get into the building before the Terminator made it through the line of cars, they had a chance. If they couldn't, they were both dead.